You know, I think in this audience, we're used to hearing certain kinds of defenses of Israel. Religious Christians and Jews are inspired to offer a defense of the Jewish people's return to their ancestral homeland that's grounded in theological reasoning, in God's covenantal promise with his chosen people. Zionists, of course, want to passionately argue for the establishment of a free sovereign state where Jewish guns wielded by a Jewish army returns hadar, dignity, that only a self-governing people can realize. Our next speaker, Victor Davis Hanson, brings a very different perspective to his analysis of Israeli politics and Israeli society. He's a classicist and a military historian, a fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's published more than 24 books, and he's among the foremost living experts on the great historian Thucydides. Thucydides' penetrating account of the war between Athens and Sparta established a link between the inner culture of a society, what a people holds high, the sources of a nation's pride, what they teach their children, and that society's projection of power on the world stage. Thucydides helps to train our political insight. He helps us to see how culture relates to domestic policy and how domestic policy relates to foreign policy. In short, Thucydides helps us think like a statesman. And that perceptive ability to see relations among political things is the gift that Victor Davis Hanson brings to his analysis of Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming him to the 2019 Conference on Jews and Conservatism.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I want to thank Roger Hertog for inviting me to speak. My wife always says, when she comes home from work, because I'm on the farm, she says, you seem to be in a good mood recently. Did Roger Hertog talk to you lately? Usually about every couple of weeks, it's like a dose of sanity. I must confess something before I start. I grew up in a very rural area south of Fresno, California, on a farm, and I still live in the same house that my great-great-great-grandmother built in 1870, and I didn't get out much, so I did not meet anybody that I knew was Jewish till I was 18. But a very funny thing happened. I always, as a sort of autodidact, was interested in Israel, and I had this memory when I was 14 in 8th grade, right out of 8th grade in the summer, and it was the lead up to the 67 war, and the McClatchy newspapers in Fresno had these maps. I think you all remember them. They had little Israel and then all of these enemies, and they had these emblems for tanks, soldiers, and planes, and I would count them up, and I'd say to my dad and mom, this little country is going to be swarmed. They have 5,000 tanks, and they only have 1,000. They have 2,000 planes, they only have 800. My father said something to me that was very Thucydidean, although he had never read Thucydides. He said, it's not machines, Victor, it's men that count. That's quoting 10 years later when I became a classics major, I always remember Thucydides said, it's not walls or the polis or ships that make a great nation, it's the people. And I've always remember that. And then when I went to UC Santa Cruz, when it had just opened, big mistake, I met the first people I knew that were Jewish, and another truth hit me, by empirical truth, that the people I argued most with as undergraduates were Jewish Americans, that I was more pro-Israel than they were. And I kept that paradox. I think most of us know that the only system, the only paradigm that works as we look around the misery of the globe past and present is Westernism, that triad of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome that gives us constitutional government and protected freedoms and also a free market, private property, dynamic economy. But that said, there were people from the very beginning when this emerged in the 7th century in Greece that were worried about a paradox, and that is that this system gave us so much freedom and so much security and wealth that if you didn't have bridles or religion or community or traditions or borders, or even existential enemies, that people would become indulgent. The Romans had a word for it, luxus. Catullus wrote a poem and said, luxus will destroy you yet, Catullus. And what he meant was sort of just enjoying the appetites of Republican Rome. But what I'm getting at is that there was a whole tradition in Aristophanes and Thucydides that warned people that Athens at its greatest, richest, most secure moment was suffering a lack of confidence that would be fatal in the 4th century. When you get to Rome, you really get this cultural pessimism. Tacitus, Livy, especially the great Republican poem Catullus, but also Juvenal and that fantastic novelist Satyricon. And some of the issues, the symptomology, are similar to our own. And that became a theme throughout Western literature, history, and culture in the Enlightenment, but back to the Renaissance as well. And then, of course, we have these German cultural pessimists. I mean, that's the wrong word. They were happy that the West was decadent because they felt never being incorporated by the Roman Empire and safely on the other side of the Danube and the Rhine, that they had added a racial component. Blut, they were not just German speakers or German residents, they were racially something that they were unique, they thought, and therefore they didn't like Western civilization, but nonetheless, some of their diagnoses in Hegel and Nietzsche and Oswald Spengler were correct. The same idea that the West would be too secure and too wealthy, and then there would be sort of an ennui that set in. And I think if we look at the world today in the West, we see a spectrum. On one side is extreme as the EU, the United States is about in the center, and I think Israel is on the other end. And I think I like to make what that other end is. So we look at certain criteria that assess the health of a Western society. One, of course, is fertility demography. In 1453, the Byzantine Empire fell on Black Tuesday, May 29th. There were 7,000 Byzantine soldiers on the walls. This is an empire that just 400 years earlier had fielded 600,000 people in an emergency. It had an enormously large population, but it committed demographic suicide. And when we look at fertility today, the EU's average fertility is 1.5. And the countries that used to be the most fertile in Europe, the southern Mediterranean countries where religious piety was considered the greatest, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Italy, it's down to 1.3. By the same token, just in the last 40 years, the United States has fallen from 2.1 to 1.7. Part of that, I think, is this $1.7 trillion student debt that postpones the forces that make one traditional and conservative even. Getting married, average age of marriage in the United States has gone from 23 to 27. Average age of first children has gone from about 26 to 31. But when you have that staggering debt, you postpone child raising, buying a home, marriage, and those are things that make a society traditional. And that's very true in Europe, but it's not true in Israel. 3.1. There's a lot of controversy how that demographic is assessed, but it's clear that Israel is the exception on that malaise of Western civilization. Another, of course, is defense. You don't have a society unless you're willing to sacrifice to protect it. Europe's average investment of GDP is about 1.4, not much higher than Germany's alone. And it's 1.4 because, after all, the United States has guaranteed its security after World War II and the Cold War, and then during the war on terror or the threat of radical Islam, the United States took the fore. And pre-Trump U.S. foreign policy, bipartisan as it was, said that there will be any threat to the Western order. It was sort of like the Roman version of Mithridates, get rid of him, or Jugurtha, get rid of him, or Boudicca, get rid of her. Any regional terrorist, regional thug. Our version was Milosevic or Noriega or Saddam or the Taliban or Gaddafi. We took that burden. We were criticized for it, but Europe didn't feel that it had to arm itself. we spend today about 3.6, and it's going down to it's going up from 3.1, it will be 3.6. Israel varies between 4 and 6, and even greater in periods of tension. So again, on that barometer, Israel seems to be much more successful in avoiding that symptom of malaise, if I could use that value-laden term. One is the idea of transcendence. You know, the Greeks were very practical. They said that we change the diapers of our babies so they will change our diapers when we're older. Or it was very important in Greek agrarian literature to plant an olive tree in your 60s, even though it wouldn't come to full bearing till you were after you were dead, as a sign that you were invested in something other than yourself. In terms of religious belief or piety, if we look at that same spectrum, it's very disturbing. It's hard to assess whether a nation is pious or believes in a religious transcendent experience, because do you calibrate it by going to synagogue or church, or what people say? Even atheists will say to a pollster they believe in God, or how often you pray. But if you look at most of those barometers, say in the Pew polls, about 15 to 20% of Europeans say they pray daily, or they attend religious services, or they feel they're part of a religion. It's about twice as high in the United States, and it's higher in Israel. So there is a greater level of transcendence in Israel as well. One thing that makes a society confident are secure borders. I mean, we all believe that America is an idea. We believe that the EU is an idea. We believe that Israel is an idea. But an idea doesn't last long unless it has a physical protected space to grow in. The United States is one of the reasons that we've avoided, to some degree, the malaise that is overwhelming Europe is we had a frontier experience. We were cut off and rejected by Europe. We created something not just synonymous with Western culture in Europe, but in some ways antithetical, and we had borders. And that frontier spirit and the Constitution that came out of it, I think, makes us a little different. But in Europe today, there's about 8 million people came in illegally and reside inside Europe. One of the reasons Erdogan has such leverage on Europe, he has about 3.5 million Middle East and North African refugees, and he can release them almost any time he wants into Europe, unless he's paid his dang geld of $3 or $4 billion and concessions on foreign policy. We do a little bit better, but in our 2,000-mile border, it isn't secure. We have 20 million, according to the Yale MIT study, of people who were not U.S. citizens or living in the United States. They broke the law. The first thing they did when they crossed the border was to break the law. The second thing they did was to break the law by residing in the United States. And the third thing was usually to get some type of identification to allow that to happen. And so we haven't really come to terms in this so-called Trumpian wall. I guess it's our version of Hadrian's Wall, which actually worked pretty well despite the left's criticism post facto. But Israel built a wall. Everybody thought that was retrograde, reactionary, it wouldn't work, it stigmatized the other, and it did work. But more importantly, it reminded the world that Israel had certain borders that it was going to defend, and it was not shy about fortifying them. And finally, there has to be a sense in the West of confidence in your past and present and future. And when you see this combination of wealth and security and freedom taken to an excess, the first thing you see is a state starts to question their past. You really see it in Europe, where almost in every political debate, somebody is dubbed a colonialist or an imperialist. And it's just a debate-ending slur or smear. And so Europe today is consciously getting rid of the idea of nationalism, that there was ever any good that came out of it. Part of this is the consequence of 2 world wars. Well, they always talk about 2 world wars as if they just sprouted, like mushrooms after a storm. They weren't organic processes. There were actually 3 wars that Germany started. Take away Germany from the equation, and nationalism is not a bad word in Europe. Europeans are always talking about these wars, and we've learned to overcome them. The real message is if you had have armed yourself and deterred yourself in 1871 and 1914 and 1939, you wouldn't have that discussion. But nevertheless, they have taken that as a referendum, and they're full of ambiguity about their traditions. We see that in the United States with this new iconoclastic movement of destroying icons of our past, whether it's a Depression-era mural in San Francisco or statues, not just of racists like Nathan Bedford Forrest, but even people who were men of principle, wrong principle, but men of principle like James Longstreet. And this insane idea to rename buildings and streets. I'm getting off on a tangent. One of the things I got in big trouble at Stanford was we decided that Junipero Serra, the father of the California mission system, was racist because he had whipped Native Americans who whipped themselves. Everybody whipped everybody in those days. So we conveniently renamed Serra Boulevard outside of my office, and I wrote a column saying, well, if we want to have a textual record of racism, let's start with Leland Stanford himself, who said he brought in Asians because they worked hard and they were inferior to white people, and let's rename Stanford Chumash University to reflect the Native American landscape. And of course, people got angry because they were invested in that brand name, and it was kind of a hoax that we only name selectively things that are not of existential importance to our career or futures. But again, it reflects sort of a cynicism, a sarcasm that's endemic in the West. I'm not suggesting that Israel does not have an agnostic and even an atheistic left, but it hasn't got the same degree of control in Europe and what's fearfully growing in the United States. Maybe you could sum up these symptomologies of Western malaise by this notion of citizenship. Citizenship was core to the West. It was a very unique idea. And for the first time in Greek text, we hear this word polites, with a precursor of the Roman kiwis. There was nothing like it anywhere else in the Near East, Egypt, that people were either subjects or helots or slaves. Not that there wasn't chattel slavery in the classical world, but there was an idea of a free person who had rights and responsibilities that was protected by a consensual government and a code of law that was ratified by a plebiscite. That was a new idea. And it's really the strength of the West. Even today as we speak, most countries don't have a concept of citizenship. And yet when we look at all of these problems in the West, they tend to reflect the idea that citizenship is under assault in the West. And it's under assault both in the pre-modern and the postmodern sense. And by that I mean we're blending the notion of a resident with a citizen. I live in a community where about half the residents are not U.S. citizens, and about half of those were here illegally. But in terms of scrutiny and voting, there is none. In terms of social services, there is none. In terms of common traditions, reverence for the poor, it's not there. Citizens are different than residents. We live in a sanctuary county, near a sanctuary city, in a sanctuary state. And if you actually look at the law, it privileges people who are residents because they're immune from the full force of federal immigration law. And by that I mean if I cross a border into the United States without a passport, I'm in big trouble, but people in my community that live next door were not in big trouble doing it. So it's almost as residency at best is synonymous with citizenship, and at worst, in some cases, it's preferable. And you can really see that in countries in Europe today, like France, even Greece, where people are fearful or afraid to say you're not a citizen, and a citizen is different than a resident. Another thing we see is a recurrence of tribalism. Citizenship was an idea that said to the resident, give up your primary allegiance to your clan or your tribe and replace it with a collective that's based on people's ideas and the fact they live in a certain place and they have a cohesive body politic. It's a very radical idea. And yet you can see in Europe in particular, in the United States as well, that multicultural identity politics is saying to the American citizen, your first allegiance is with your tribe. You identify as transgender, or you identify as gay or Chicano or black first, and American second. And we know where that goes. It's the road to Iraq, or it's the road to Rwanda, or it's the road to the Balkans. But it is at the pre-modern level, we're going back to the era before the citizenship. I don't want to blame the underclass because the same thing is happening among the elites. Citizenship is eroding in the West on the postmodern side. And you can see with this new concept, I shouldn't say new, Socrates said he was a citizen of the world. But when Barack Obama said, I'm president of the United States, but I feel like I'm president of the world. And we had the left say, we're all citizens of the world. That is a direct assault to the US citizen or the German citizen or the French citizen, because it suggests that your elected leaders that you elected and people who did not elect them abroad will then have equitable treatment in this zero-sum game. We also have a concerted attack on our traditions and laws, both informal and formal. What good does it do to have a Second Amendment if you live in the country and you can't buy bullets at Dick's or Walmart because of social pressures have been put on them? Or you have a constitutionally protected electoral college. Since 1869, we have a court of 9 justices, but we see assaults, and I'm saying that all of the Democratic candidates have endorsed getting rid of the Electoral College, and 6 of them have endorsed packing the court up to 15 justices again. So again, this idea that citizen has a common tradition, common rules and laws, it's different from peasantry, it's different from residency, and it's different from tribalism on one hand, and it's not a citizenship of the world, and it's not a continually Jacobin effort to revise and destroy and create laws as you see fit. And in this spectrum, Israel does pretty well again. It really does. It has a sense of place, it has a law, it has the people themselves, although there's again, a strong debate between right and left. There's a sense that we are living in the same place that our ancestors did 3,500 years ago, and nobody, damn it, is going to change the name of Jerusalem, or they're not going to change this particular street. And even people who might have ideological differences are not saying Ben Gurion is a dirty word. We're not going to do that now. So this all begs the question, what is Israel doing differently than Europe at the extreme and even the United States? Most people would say, well, they have no choice. They live in a very tough neighborhood where there's no margin of error, and one mistake is not a political defeat or an optional war loss, but it ends their very existence. I think that's true. And there have been 5 major wars that Israel has survived, and they're in a constant state of military readiness because there's people who want to kill them. Others would say, I think rightly, that they live with the burden of the Holocaust and the fact that 6 million Jews were wiped out, not in Africa, not in Asia, not in Latin America, but it's supposedly in the most humane society in the history of civilization, in the heart of Europe, and not just by the plague of Nazism, but by the acquiescence of Western Europe as well. The most liberal people in the world didn't really lift a finger. And today people understand that of the world's 14 million Jews, 80% of them live in the United States or Israel. That there's not very large Jewish population anywhere else for a reason. And that reminds Israelis every day that if they get when they're in extremis and they believe they can appeal to the good nature of the French prime minister or president, or they want to seek advice from the Chancellor of Germany, or they think even a British prime minister might offer them succor, it's not going to happen, or at least they can't take that chance. Those are practical reasons why Israel seems to have avoided, as I said earlier, these symptomology of malaise. But I think there's other reasons as well, and that is that there's a sense of confidence in Israel that they are in a historical place. They're a small people, and they understand that the world has not been kind necessarily to the Jewish people, and it's not going to happen again. There's a sense as well that this land is not theirs alone. It was their ancestors. They're only renting it now, and they're going to pass it on to their children. And they have a sense of historical duty the way that we used to in the United States, when you talk about Okinawa, people fought in the old breed at Iwo Jima. There was a sense that they were fighting for a particular place in America, a particular geographical place, particular values, and it was not going to die on their watch, and they were going to pass it on. And you didn't have to be perfect to be good, and you were better than the alternative, and that's all you needed. And that sense of mission and historicity is still very strong in Israel, despite all these practical reasons why Israel is not shrinking as most Western countries are, why it spends and invests in its defense, why it is still a transcendent and religious society, why it still honors the idea of citizenship, why it has defensible borders, is not apologetic about securing them. And the result of all this is, I think, if you looked at Israel 30 years ago, when these Western symptoms of, I don't want to use the word decay, but I'll go ahead and use it, of decline were starting to really worry people, nobody would have said in the year 2019, Israel of all places that people used to say, why was God so unkind to Israel not to give it oil or natural gas? That it would be consuming 1% of its natural gas production. In other words, it has 30 trillion cubic feet of natural gas at its disposal. And that's because it had a confident approach in this age of climate change and opposition to horizontal drilling or oceanic fracking to become a powerful, muscular country and not only be energy independent, but exporting energy, as it is now to Jordan and soon to Egypt. If people had said 30 years ago, your arch rival, challenge, enemy, whatever term we use, the Palestinians will implode in the year 2019. And by that I mean people in the United States will move the embassy to Jerusalem and there won't be an intifada. A president of the United States will declare that the Golan Heights is not going back to Syria and there won't be a war over that. Or somebody will say the Palestinians are not refugees after 70 years, any more than the Volga Germans are, or the million Jews that were ethnically cleansed from the Middle East, or even the 13 million Germans who walked back after World War II. All of these were refugees. All of them are not refugees, but why did we use that term of the Palestinians? What I'm getting at is there's been fundamental changes in the attitude toward Israel. And when you ask yourself, they're now energy independent. Their economy has almost $41,000 of individual GDP on average. Its economy is booming. Who would have ever believed 30 years ago that the Sunni monarchies would look to Israel for their security? It's just absolutely unthinkable that people in the Arab world would say, oh yeah, forget about the Palestinians, we're worried about Iran, and you have the technological expertise and the strategic insight to save us. Same with Egypt and Jordan. It's incomprehensible. I know that right now it has existential enemies in Iran, and I think to a lesser extent, but to an extent in Turkey. And yet the world itself is suspicious of Turkey, especially in the West, in Europe, and the United States, and it's very suspicious of Iran. Not just because of their own security, because I think they realize that the stronger Israel is and the more confident it has shown itself in the last 30 years, and the idea that it has avoided much of the malaise that is overwhelming Europe and threatens the United States, it becomes better like the stronger that it is. I know that that goes against the therapeutic view of human nature, but I tend to err on the side of the tragic view, that people believe in the Middle East that there would be no better friend than Israel, to quote the dictator Solomon, there would be no worse enemy than Israel. And that makes people admire Israel in a way that you're not supposed to do in the postmodern 21st century. I'd like to conclude then with an odd thought, that we always talk about Israel as a subordinate ally of the United States, or a subordinate friend, or a force of stability in the Middle East, or a vicarious friend that can do our bidding, but it actually isn't. It's 9 million people actually are a canary in the mine. They're a great gift to Western civilization because they say to Western civilization, you can be very prosperous, you can have a lot of individual freedom, but that does not mean you have to be apologetic and you have to be decadent and you have to be slaves to your appetite. There are still fundamental elements of Western civilization that go back to its founding, and that is a secure place in the secure borders with a proud tradition and confidence in the future, military readiness, a belief in transcendence, and the idea that it's still traditional and valuable for both your country and your family to have children and get married. And that seems banal, but at this late date in Western civilization, that's been a godsend to all of us. Thank you very much.